Hi, I'm Olivia, and today I want to talk about how I went about using the Genki textbooks. So I'll be detailing exactly what my approach was, as well as throwing in some things that I wish I had done differently, because I definitely think I could have adjusted some things to be a bit more strategic in my approach. So to give you a quick overview, I went through both of the Genki textbooks as well as the workbooks, and I went through the first textbook in about 2 to 3 weeks, and I went through the second textbook in about a month. So I went through them pretty fast, but I was putting in a few hours every day, and my philosophy when I was going through these textbooks was to gain familiarity with the language, to become accustomed to the different grammar structures, to build my vocabulary base. But my goal was not to memorize everything in these textbooks. I wasn't trying to have an unwavering understanding of every single grammar point. My aim with the textbooks was just to gain an initial familiarity with how the language worked in a controlled environment, knowing that I'd attain that deeper understanding through repeated exposure to the language in more natural forms than you'd find in a textbook. So let me walk you through how I approached each chapter. On the first page, we have a dialogue, which will incorporate some vocabulary and grammar that we will be learning in the chapter to come. Now, for the first chapter or two, you probably won't know enough yet to understand what you're reading because you just started. So if you're in that situation, start by just trying to sound out the words and get used to reading hiragana and katakana. The first two chapters will have this romanji to help you out, so you're not going to have to flip to the front or the back of the book to check out what each character makes, but don't rely on this too heavily. Try covering it with a piece of paper while you're sounding everything out, and then reveal it afterwards to check if you're on the right track. These textbooks also come with audio tracks, so I would always listen to it while reading to make sure that I had the right pronunciation. So after I had gone through and read the dialogue, I would try and see how much of the sentence I could understand on my own. I'd see if there are any words that I recognized, if I recognized any patterns in the sentence, if I could guess what they were talking about from the picture or the title, and I'd also pay attention to the audio track and see if I could infer what was going on by the tone of the voices. So did it sound like they were asking a question? Were they happy or sad? And then after I'd given it my best shot, I'd check the translation of the dialogue to see what it meant. After reading this and knowing what the dialogue had said, I would go back and see if I could figure out what each part of the sentence meant without having checked the grammar explanations or the vocabulary list as yet. So I would just go line by line looking at the translation and looking at the original dialogue and see if I could map out what each part of the sentence meant. So I would go and see if I could figure out what certain words meant. I could take a guess at what a certain grammar structure was doing, and then I would move on to the vocabulary section. So on the next page of the chapter, you will find the vocabulary list. And if you see here where there are stars next to the words, these are the words that were already used in the dialogue on the last page. So I would start by listening to the audio track of these words being read out loud, and I'd follow along, and then I would start learning these words. When I did this, I was using Memrise, which is really quick and easy to get started with, so if you're brand new to the language, I think it's a good starting point for learning vocabulary. But if you've been studying for a while, or you don't want to have to switch vocabulary programs later down the line, I would recommend learning those words using Anki. And in the description box, I'll link where you can find a deck with all of the words in the Genki textbooks. Now, when I was doing this, I was learning all the vocabulary for the chapter in one day, and I don't recommend doing this. I was spending over an hour every day learning all the new words and doing all my reviews. So I think a better approach would be, instead of learning all of the words on the same day, to spread it out over multiple days. So pick a number of new words that you want to learn each day and add to your review system. And once you run out of words for chapter 1, then you can start learning the chapter 2 words, even if you haven't got there yet. You might even want to give yourself a head start and start learning your vocabulary before you get the textbook. So if you're waiting for it to arrive in the mail, you can get started on learning that vocabulary right away. Because I really found that my biggest hurdle when I was going through Genki 2 was that I had gone through the vocabulary in Genki 1 so fast, and I was just overwhelmed with how many reviews I had to do every day. So don't add dozens of words to your review system in one day, because it's going to be hard to keep it up in the long term. So don't try to rush vocabulary. A good rule of thumb is anywhere between 5 and 20, because if you come across a word that you don't know when you're going through the textbook, all you have to do is flip back to this page and look up what it means, or on a lot of pages it will actually have the translation right there for you. So next is the grammar section. So for each grammar point, I would read the description, and I would also make sure I was reading all of the example sentences to practice my reading. And make sure when you're doing this, you cover the romanji if it's there, and the translation, and then once you've read it, you can check to see if you got it right. For the first while, I took notes, and then I stopped doing it because I found that writing it down wasn't super beneficial to me. But if you find that writing things down in your own words helps you with your understanding, then definitely go for it. But for me personally, I find writing notes to be too tedious, and I never look back at them anyways. So what I would do is I just go back to the textbook if I needed a refresher. So one thing I did start to do was that I would highlight and underline important parts of my textbook so that when I did go back back and review it, it was a lot easier for me to find. So you can see on this chapter, I highlighted the main use of the grammar point and I underlined it in the example sentences. And when I was learning about these grammar points, I would often flip back to the dialogue at the beginning of the chapter and find an example of the point being used there. So once again, I was only trying to build familiarity with these grammar points. I was not trying to memorize them. So I wasn't spending hours and hours trying to understand how each point worked. Once I felt I had a decent understanding of what was going on, I would go to the next. But if you are struggling in understanding what the textbook is talking about, you can always go online and find another description, and hopefully the way it's presented there will make more sense to you. I usually went through all the grammar points for a chapter in one day, and it usually took me around an hour. And then at the end of each chapter, there will be a culture note, and it will teach you something about Japanese culture. So the next thing we have is the exercise section. Now, this may be a bit controversial, but I actually skipped a lot of the exercises. I found a lot of them required a partner, or they were really focused on speaking and writing practice, so language production. But my goal at the time was really to focus on language comprehension, so reading and listening. I really wanted to focus on my comprehension of the language before trying to produce it on my own, because the only thing I'd be able to do at this point would be really awkward textbook talk and not how actual people speak. So I wanted to wait until I had a better understanding of the basics before I tried to use it on my own. So many of the audio questions will be call and response style. So it will ask you a question and then there will be a pause for you to answer it in Japanese. And then it will say what the correct answer was. I would usually skip this middle part and just listen to the question and the answer and try to understand what is being said. And sometimes I would shadow the audio and repeat back what they were saying to try to get the right pronunciation. If there was a question that was more writing based, I would turn it into a reading exercise. So I'd read all the questions and make sure I understood them, but I usually wouldn't take the time to write out my answer to the questions. And then on the last page of the chapter, they'll show us some useful expressions, and I would read through these and listen to the audio track. And then depending on what the topic was, I might add it to my vocabulary reviews. Now, before we start the next chapter, we have a few more places that we need to look. Now, at the back of your textbook, there is this reading and writing section, and this is where there'll be a lot of exercises that are based on each chapter. For chapter 1 and 2, it's going to be mostly focused on hiragana and katakana and just getting you familiar with the different characters. But then starting on chapter 3, they're going to introduce kanji. So I was already learning kanji with Wanikani, so I didn't pay too much attention to this page. I'd mostly just skim it and see if there were any characters that I hadn't learned yet, but otherwise I would just move on. And then after this, there'll be some reading and writing exercises, and I would actually do most of these. The main ones that I would skip is if it was asking me to do kind of like a journal entry style of question. I would usually skip those. I'd pay the most attention to the reading exercises and also listening to the audio tracks for those passages. So after you've finished the chapter in the textbook, both in the front and the back of the book, you'll also have the workbook. So by now you may have guessed that I did not do the entire thing, but I found the exercises in here a lot more enjoyable than the ones that I found in the textbook. So I actually did a fair amount in the first one. The workbook is also divided into two parts. The first chunk is called conversation and grammar. So there's lots of writing and listening exercises. For the first few chapters, I actually did nearly all of the questions and just got used to writing in Japanese, and I would always do the listening comprehension questions. But as I got farther along, I stopped doing most of the writing questions, and I would simply make sure that I could understand what the question was asking and just get in some reading practice there. At the back of the workbook, we have this reading and writing section, and here you'll be given space to drill writing hiragana, katakana, as well as the kanji from the textbook, and then there's some problems where you can use it. I did nearly all of these for the first workbook because I really enjoyed learning how to write it, but if writing isn't a priority for you right now, you could save it for later. So that is how I went through the Genki textbooks, and I went through both of them in about 2 months. Like I said, I was doing a couple hours every day, and I'd usually spend 1 to 3 days per chapter. What I would normally do was the dialogue, the vocabulary, and the grammar section on the first day, and then I would do the exercises in both the textbook and the workbook on the second and third day. So I think a better approach to take would probably be, instead of learning all of your vocabulary on one day, to spread it out over multiple days and focus more of your energy on the reading and listening exercises than the writing and speaking exercises. If you want to do all the exercises, totally go for it, but if you're like me and you don't really enjoy doing exercises that much and you want to focus on your language comprehension before your language production, just skip any questions that you don't feel are fitting that style of learning, and then you can put that time into building your vocabulary a bit faster, maybe by starting that Tango N5 deck with Anki that I talked about, or you could even start reading some beginner materials that have a built-in dictionary. If there's anything that I missed or if you have any questions, let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a like so more people can find it, and make sure you're subscribed if you want to see more. That's all I have for today, and I'll see you soon.